Hello and welcome to PK's webinar on starting your sustainability journey with digital engineering. Before we get started with today's presentation, I want to remind everyone that all attendees have been muted and today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registrants. We encourage all attendees to get involved today in our discussion by including any questions you may have in the Q&A tool platform. At this point, I'd like to introduce Sean Ennis, our Director of PK's EDGE Center of Excellence.
Thank you, Chelsea. So welcome everyone to the Starting Your Sustainability Journey with Digital Engineering, sponsored by PK Global. Our agenda for today will start with introductions to our expert panelists. Our focus will then shift to a remarkable success story around digital sustainability that only L&B Realty advisors can share. To explain how those results were achieved, we'll walk through the solution with our partners, Carbon Lighthouse and Optio3. Lastly, we want to share how PK can help you get started on your digital journey. Please post any questions in the webinar platform. With any time left over, we'll try to get to them. First up, let's introduce our panelists. Hi, I'm Sean Ennis. I'm privileged and proud to run the EDGE Center of Excellence here at PK, where we have thousands of digital Jedi to help customers achieve their EDGE digital outcomes. Joining with me is Joe Barrett, VP Sales, Optio3. They provide hyperscale device detection, data collection, and classification as a service powered by machine learning in over 25 million square feet of office buildings, hospitals, universities, schools, and other municipal buildings, automating building data collection down to days versus manual processes that typically take months. Next up is Brendan Milstein, the co-founder and president of Carbon Lighthouse. For over a decade, Carbon Lighthouse has been using data-driven solutions and expertise to eliminate carbon emissions from one of the world's biggest sources, the buildings we all work and visit. Brendan will be talking about the market drivers behind this increasing ESG pressures and how Carbon Lighthouse delivers their data-backed decarbonization for clients like L&B Realty. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Eric Smith, EVP Business Development for L&B Realty Advisors. Eric has the business experience of launching, managing, and profiting off of a sustainability project. But more importantly, he'll be able to provide us all with the insights of making a sustainability project sustainable. But before getting to Eric, let's set the stage for today. Sustainability is a $12 trillion business opportunity. As seen currently by Wall Street, we've all seen that rise in strength of the ESG investments. That $12 trillion is not a casino wager. Where we believe we can make a difference, though, is that sustainability projects are just another form of digital transformation. Well, how? Well, first, sustainability projects need to be sustainable. That means agile projects defined by real, profitable business cases. Next, you need accountability. That is where the monitoring comes in. You cannot manage what you do not measure. Lastly, we have strategies to tackle sustainability at a band to minimize the impact on day-to-day operations. The end results are better OpEx efficiencies, better knowledge and intelligence of your facilities, and putting it simply, saving you money on your utility bills. So now that you have the basics, let me reintroduce Eric, who will take you through his experience on launching successfully a sustainability project. Eric?
Hey, thank you, Sean. I think we're in the real estate sector, and we run $9 billion of institutional real estate across the United States on behalf of primarily pension funds. So about 10 years ago, the whole conversation around ESG emerged, and people started figuring it out. What I would say is, you have to have a plan. So Sean mentioned a problem or an opportunity. If it's an opportunity, if you have a plan, and it's a problem if you don't have a plan. Increasingly, particularly with respect to tenant users and investors on our side. So we're in the commercial real estate sector. I think 8 years ago, we started developing our, ESG policy. We call it ESG plus R, resilience, and climate change, and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we wrap all of those into what we call our responsible investment policy, which basically what we found is making progress across all of those initiatives creates value with respect to real estate. So, what we found, and again, commercial real estate investment, we have 4 major sectors or food groups, if you will. There's office buildings, there's multifamily apartment projects, industrial warehouse buildings, and retail, all the way from grocery anchored center to malls. So the first portion of developing a plan is, what are the material ESG factors that relate to that sector? And then, because every property is unique, what factors relate to that specific property specifically? So that's kind of our first step. You could see some material ESG factors on the bottom of this page across the environmental, social, and governance factors. Obviously, natural resources is an important part. And when you look at office buildings specifically, it's an excellent opportunity because they use approximately 40% or cause 40% of the emissions in the United States. The next thing you need to do once you've determined the materiality of the ESG factors in relation to your business is put together a team, and ideally with a diversity of thought and personality, which I'll say. I think it's important to put people on that team who may not disagree or may not agree with ESG initiatives, because you want a well-rounded group. You want the introverts to be in there. Yeah, you want them to speak up, but more importantly, you want everybody to buy in to the ESG plan for your business. So then you get into a plan. And the other thing I'll say about the plan is, you're not going to fix all of this in one day. This is an incremental initiative that where you need to make small steps that have big impacts, is what I'll call it. And so it needs to be practical. We can't do everything at once. I use the example of electric cars. There's 1.5 billion cars in the world and 7.6 million electric vehicles. So we're not going to obviously produce our way to electric vehicles in 10 years, but we have to do something, and we all need to realize that. So it's not just good. It's not good for the climate. This is also good business. You have to figure out a way where you can do this, where you do good for society, you do good for the climate change, but you also make money at it, and you also draw your clients and your tenants in. But most importantly, your investors. Increasingly, we're seeing investors become very sensitive to this issue, and they want to know you're making progress. So how do you do that? The first step is, you've got to measure. You've got to come up with the right measurements for each of those initiatives. You got to come up with realistic goals, and then you have to measure toward those goals. So we found that is probably one of the most important thing, is because we have to measure to set a baseline. And then each year, again, we're after incremental improvement. Each year we measure ourselves against what our past performance has been, or our goals, depending on the initiative. So we're big believers in incremental improvement ESG. We just don't think the solution set is available in the market right now to cover it all. And so we're looking at technology and process improvements. And that's where we like the technology is, earlier on, in 2008, 2009, we were going with AquaCore and Mach Energy, just evaluating, the power input for a particular office building. But what we realized is it took a human to actually make a decision on every single piece or every single recommendation where you could save power. And so it really didn't give us an automatic solution that we were looking for. And that's where we went with Carbon Lighthouse. And, we realized it's pretty well automatic, with their process. So, we think that energy efficiency is one of the major components of an ESG program. You can see the LEED certifications that we've had for our properties in the market. And, I think we're a believer in the future that, you're going to satisfy more of your tenant customers or our tenant customers and our investors if we follow this plan. So Sean, can I see the next page? So this example of an office building we did in Miami, Florida, and going through our process, we found 400,000 in total savings, and you've got the savings there in terms of climate change, you've got the savings there, where that fits into our ESG strategy is, it's a climate change. So it's R, and it's with respect to climate change, we're looking to do two things: adapt and mitigate. And so, Carbon Lighthouse has been remarkably responsive to us in this, and they've done it in an automatic way where, on the ongoing, we don't really have to do a lot going forward. It's been done for us, and all in a really unique way. So Sean, let me get the next one. So of our lessons learned, just again, as a commercial real estate manager, is you've got to understand what the material ESG factors are first. That's the first step in terms of whatever your business is. Again, it's different for us between office buildings, multifamily buildings or apartment buildings, and or industrial warehouses. Because, if you have an industrial warehouse, the electric bill is a couple $100 a month because they have very small office components. So materiality is the first step. Measure, we can't manage what we don't measure. That's why there are groups called UNPRI, the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, that, started in 2005. And then you had GRESB emerge, which is the Global Real Estate, Sustainability Board. You've got SASB that emerged in 2011, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So you had all these emerging standards that emerged about 10 years ago, and people have been just trying to figure out what applies to us. So, make sure those standards apply to you, and then make sure you measure what you need to measure to accommodate your goals. In terms of life cycle, what we're looking for is incremental improvement. We think the solution sets aren't necessarily here yet. We're looking for them, but you need to be flexible when you look for them. You need to test technologies. You need to adopt the ones that work, and you need to look for platforms of technologies that you can solve a variety of different goals using one platform or the fewest platforms possible. So we're evaluating newer technologies. We're evaluating operational innovations, because we often find that those technologies lead to operational innovations. So we're sensitive to keeping an eye out for that. And then the other thing is we need to adopt and we need to scale durable solutions. So once you test and that technology works, how do you roll that out and scale that across all of the properties in your portfolio? So, I think, we're on a path. It's been a long journey, quite frankly, but we're glad we're on it and we're making money on it, which is what our goal was. So, without any further ado, I just want to thank Brendan, for his great technology and, partnership, because we've made a lot of money, a happy client. And, I'm just thrilled with the technology.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you all for joining us today. I am Brendan Milstein, president and co-founder of Carbon Lighthouse. Carbon Lighthouse makes it profitable for commercial and industrial buildings to decarbonize. Now, decarbonize can mean different things to different people. Our ultimate goal is to get our clients' portfolios of buildings to net zero. However, we are certainly happy to settle for science-based targets. And I think to Eric's point about making meaningful incremental progress, we're very happy to help facilitate our clients doing whatever is profitable to reduce emissions. So making it profitable, making it easy to decarbonize a portfolio is what we're all about. We launched in 2010, and Sean, if you could hit next slide, please. And since then, we've eliminated the emissions of equivalent to about 18 power plants. That's if you measure by the typical power plant in California, which is about 150 megawatt single cycle turbine natural gas plant. And from a business perspective, to get on from the environmental elements, our clients are saving a little more than about $250 million a year in energy. So this is an exciting number. It's not actually the prize, though. And to Eric's points about there is investor demand for this, the $500,000 we saved at One Biscayne, the case study Eric was talking through, that's not the main prize. The extra $1 million in asset value isn't the prize. And Sean, if you could go to the next slide, please. Then the real prize for meaningful ESG is being driven by demand, both from the consumer side and the investor side. So Eric's role is to manage institutional capital. The real prize here is the extra 10 billion in assets under management Eric will get for outperforming his peers, both financially and on ESG. So ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, and we're really focusing primarily on the environmental and social part here, but ESG is becoming a massive driver. So you have the Larry Fink letter, which is, talking about moving into divesting. You have some of the largest money managers in the world, both private and public, divesting in fossil. So New York Pension Fund is divesting in fossil. A number of Canadians are divesting in fossil. California pensions, CalPERS, CalSTRS have had pretty stringent ESG requirements for a while. And Europe is significantly ahead of the US here. So in terms of capital allocation, it is increasingly going towards companies that have meaningful ESG results. On the consumer side, the movement is even more forceful. So a fun fact I recently learned, by 2025, 3/4 of the workforce will be a millennial or younger. So millennials are not perhaps the 23-year-olds people have in mind. This is now middle management. Zennials, I believe, or Gen Z is what people are thinking of as the fresh out of college grads. And the number one and number two issues for 75% of the workforce is now climate change and the pandemic. And depending on when you ask the question, the order of those can flip-flop. So there is immense consumer demand now for meaningful ESG results. There is immense capital market demand for meaningful ESG results. And with the Biden administration, at least in the US, there is now ever more forceful government regulation. But that is not just at the federal level. Municipalities are starting to stand up pretty significant laws. So New York City, for example, has a law where if office buildings don't hit a carbon intensity by a certain date, there are very heavy financial penalties. Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, many of the major cities in the US that house about half of the total office buildings and other commercial buildings in the US already have or are now passing laws like this. So demand is coming from capital markets, demand is coming from consumers, and there's regulation as well. So this trend is pretty significant and it's moving quickly. There are $7 trillion spent per year on fossil fuels, and who is going to be the recipient of that money is about to change and quickly over the next decade. Sean, next slide, please. There is a catch, however, which is any business model predicated on people being stupid is risky. And capital markets and consumers are getting smarter by the month here. So the greenwashing, or pretending to have meaningful ESG results that I think a lot of firms could get away with in the early 2000s, that's not passing muster anymore. So technology has changed, data has changed, and we can measure real metrics. So to Eric's comment on we can't manage what we can't measure, we can measure pretty easily now carbon intensity of buildings. We can measure energy spend of buildings. We can measure both of those by the 15-minute period. It's easy to track these things. And when capital management is considering capital outlays of billions of dollars, it is a risky business plan to try and pretend to have results that you don't. So what we are seeing in terms of all of these trends, I'm personally really excited about as a tree-hugging hippie here, particularly capitalistic tree-hugging hippie, but nonetheless, those are my roots, which is meaningful results in the form of data. And those who have the right data, like Eric, are getting the capital allocations. Next slide, please. Now, thankfully, the right data and, as importantly, what to do with it, this is Carbon Lighthouse's business. So what we do is we make it easy for owners and managers of commercial and industrial buildings to take action. So the way our efficiency production service works is it starts and ends with that data. So it starts with the data we've been streaming to our platform. Our cloud platform is called Clues. So we've been streaming data to it since 2010. So we have more than 100 million square feet in the portfolio now streaming data. So it's a pretty ludicrously developed data set, which is pretty exciting. And when new clients sign up, we begin streaming data from their portfolios as well. All of this data streams into our Clues AI platform. And what this platform lets us do is make people money, reduce energy and hence CO2, and save people time. Those are the main outputs of the platform. And I think the key distinction here is that recommendations can be helpful, but they are very hard to act on and make real and convert into a number. What are the dollar savings? What is the dollar benefit? What is the actual cost in a bankable, financeable way? And what are the real CO2 savings? And can I report on those metrics in a robust enough fashion that I can capture consumer demand and demand from capital markets? That is the question. And that is what our Clues software answers. So we take all of this data in, and what we produce from it is not recommendations, but for every single building in a client's portfolio is, first of all, a prioritized list of buildings. So Eric mentioned industrial buildings that pay $200 a year for electricity don't matter that much from a financial perspective. They also don't matter that much from a carbon perspective, just not a lot of energy use or carbon there. So we can give clients a prioritized list, which is, okay, you have 200 buildings, you have 50 buildings in your portfolio. These 10 are going to make you the most money and save you the most carbon. Start there. And for every one of those buildings, we have not just recommendations, but the actual bid language. So a facilities team can take action directly or drop it into RFPs for their existing contractors. And all of our scopes of work start with low cost, no cost. So the concept here is to make the most money, get the fastest reductions in CO2 as quickly as possible, and then track and go for more. So part of that initial scope of work tends to be additional sensors. So we can stream data from the site in a continuous fashion. And from that extra data, we're able to find ever more ways to reduce energy consumption, ever more ways to increase value of the buildings, ever more ways to increase profit coming out of those buildings, while continuing to cram down CO2 emissions. So that is the system. Again, the results have been favorable. So more than $250,000 in savings for our clients in terms of increased asset value, actually significantly higher than that, so several billions. And additional capital allocations is the main goal here. Part of our system hinges on actually having useful data from the building. And for that, we rely often on partners. And this is where Optio3 comes in. So I'll pass to Optio3 to talk about how to actually get data out of the building so it can be acted upon.
Thank you, Brendan. And thanks everybody for joining our webinar today. So Joe Barrett, VP of Sales at Optio3, and what we're all about is radically simplifying the access to the valuable data that's hidden within physical assets, buildings and commercial real estate, trucks and trailers and containers and commercial transportation, more so the equipment on the shop floor than the actual buildings in manufacturing, to Brendan's point. And in the energy and utility markets, there's all kinds of fun things that we can do there that'll help provide ongoing visibility into these mission critical systems to help our customers meet their revenue, compliance, and sustainability goals. So next slide, please. Let's take an example, because we've been talking a lot about commercial real estate here. I'm going to drag you through the data pipeline problem here, just for a little bit of fun. So imagine a building like the One Biscayne Way building that Brendan referred to with Eric's company. You know, these buildings have tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of individual sensors that are measuring all of the things that are going on in the building. If you can click here for me. Part of the challenge in that is those sensors are provided by one of hundreds of different vendors. And at the base level of moving data around, there's protocols that describe how you interpret the data. And there's a whole lot of those, and some of them are proprietary, which makes this kind of a nightmare. We talk about buildings as snowflakes in the built environment world because they're so unlike from one to another. And at the root of that, one of the other interesting problems is when a building is put together, there's a whole system that controls everything that goes on. And there's an engineer that sits at that and literally creates the names for things. And from Monday to Tuesday, if that building engineer is having a bad day, he may use a different name for the same thing that he did on Monday on Tuesday. And then you get a new building engineer, and all of a sudden that person has a different way of describing things. And then you do a tenant improvement, and all of a sudden there's a whole lot of new equipment and things get scrambled. And at the end of the day, this creates in data science world what we call, click forward for me, please, the Tower of Babel problem. That we could literally have 50,000 sensors in one building and 50,000 sensors in another building, and Brendan's got a portfolio of 100 million square feet. Getting that all normalized and classified into a standard descriptive language so that the clues model can get access to data in days rather than in months, and to be able to turn around the value for people like Eric in 60 days or less, to be able to save all this kind of money, increase net asset values, is the dirty little secret of the problem of automation of these data pipelines. And this is an example from commercial real estate. If we click forward, I can show you a couple of other examples. This same problem exists across multiple verticals. So here's an example of a heavy duty tractor trailer rig. There's as many as 15 different pieces of aftermarket hardware that are attached to this trailer and tractor. They all use different protocols, different vendors, different communication strategies, and the owners, the leasing companies, the operators, the investors, and the service providers who want to do stuff to these assets all depend on getting actionable, accurate, automated data out of this asset. Exact same problem as we have in commercial real estate, just a different flavor. If we click ahead, if you go into the utilities space, the utilities industry has a bunch of very stable but old protocols that dominate most of what goes on. And today what they're facing is things like distributed energy resources. These are basically off-grid producers who are putting power back into the grid. And so there's a whole set of dynamics that are brand new to the system that are coming from equipment that is not old SCADA systems. It's not transmission and distribution assets that the utilities are used to working with. Now I've got new protocols. Now I've got new vendors. And that's just in the core part of their business of, you know, generation, transmission, and distribution, depending on the utility. But there's also 5,000, 10,000 vehicles running around trying to service all these assets and all the end customers, which look a whole lot like that transportation example I just showed you a minute ago. And so this is another industry that's experiencing a rapid need for this automation of data discovery, collection, and classification. And the last example here, since we've talked about it a little bit before, is the manufacturing use case. So as we said, there may not be you know, tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of energy savings opportunities in these kinds of buildings, although some consume more energy than other. But the value of a minute of downtime in a continuous process manufacturing facility, it's a lot like a data center or anything else, like a financial payment gateway. downtime has a massive cost of money, and being able to get ahead of predicting the likely issues that are going to arise of equipment that operates in a system, so not at the individual piece of equipment level, but at the entire system level, is a really complex challenge. It has protocols, vendors, and connectivity issues just like the others. So, what we're doing is working with companies like Carbon Lighthouse and others to be able to liberate this data in forms that allow them to add value to help these owners and operators and investors and service providers all do their jobs quickly at the right cost and with the right data fidelity and integrity. So passing it back to you, Sean.
Thanks, Joe. Again, great learnings here. First you kind of define your transformation criteria. That's what Eric was telling us. And then as Joe talked about, you get the data, you monitor the data. And with that high quality facility data, you can create the necessary blueprints for sustainability to execute that transformation. And that's where Carbon Lighthouse comes in. But what PK has learned from all of this is that all sustainability journeys are different. The technology may be the same, but the process and the people are different. Success can only be achieved through aligning your internal resources from executive to operational to marketing leaders. Every journey is going to be different, and where PK can help is charting that path, discovering how to get the necessary data, cooperative workshops to uplift IT resources, assessing where your processes and technology are actual and desired. From there, you can have a roadmap so that you can put those quick wins in that we're talking about in that evergreen sustainability life cycle. As Eric talked about, these projects are iterative successes, not a waterfall one, right? PK being your trusted advisor to help you achieve these sustainability goals in a business sustainable way. But as LNB stated, getting started is the hardest part. And with that in mind, PK is working together with Optio3 and Carbon Lighthouse. We constructed a comprehensive approach to get you on your path. So, first is the education. We work with stakeholders to understand the goals and ambitions of the team and the project. We workshop with your IT and facilities teams to get a good understanding of what your pre-existing investments are that can be leveraged. And at this point, we could start that process, as we talked about, selecting an instrumentation of your facilities, picking those top 5, as Brendan talked about, and then leveraging Optio3's platform where data can be collected and analyzed and validated in a quick time frame, like Joe was talking about. With that high quality facility data out of Optio3, we load it into Carbon Lighthouse's model, and that output will be that cost benefit with insured guarantees so that you could predict that future ROI of this particular digital transformation. And after 90 calendar days with minimal impact, your team will have that comprehensive business, operational, and technical plan to achieve your sustainability goals. Now, I'd like to take the time to thank Eric with LNB Realty Advisors for coming, sharing his journey with you today, as well as all the other panelists and partners for their time. Thank you for attending PK's Edge webinar. Sustainability is only one part of our capabilities at the Edge here. If you have any questions about sustainability or any other Edge solution we offer, please contact me, as you can see here with my contact information, or your sales and account manager for more information.
Hey,
so Chelsea, let's see if we have any time for those questions.
Yep, looks like we have some time for a few questions that were submitted. One question: what has changed technologically that enabled the access to all the data and make it so powerful and actionable today?
I'd be happy to get started on that one if you don't mind. So there's two two technological drivers and one business driver. Technologically, what's happened is we've had the maturity of cloud platforms that have driven out an enormous amount of cost and have enabled a rapid time to value to be able to stand up cloud systems, unlike we had back in the 2000s. You know, the cloud is not new, but this version of the cloud is a much more mature and much more economically functional option for all of us that build in the cloud. And the second thing that we've found is the ability to apply machine learning and the quantity of data we can get enabled by this cloud stuff allows us to build models, which in our business are about how can we understand the 5 million ways to describe the piece of equipment that are in buildings and trucks and factories, and automagically turn that into structured, useful, accurate data. And you know, one of the key drivers has been the whole recognition that ESG is a business opportunity, not a pain in the neck or something we should pretend to be doing. So that's what I see from our perspective. Brendan, I'm sure you have some of that same kind of experience.
Definitely. I was gonna, Eric, it looked like you wanted to chime in on this though before I go.
No, I was saying I was hoping you and Joe would cover that.
Fabulous. I'll add, first I'll double down on just cheap compute power and cheap sensors. So our Clues platform, you know, one of the first things it does is run 10 to 20,000 simulations of a building. And that, you know, we just spin up hundreds of servers online and it costs us like $10 from Amazon. And that's outrageous. You know, any one of those servers is equivalent to something like 10,000 computers that we could have gotten in 1992. And so the fidelity with which we can run models and figure out, okay, let's update the control sequence, because if we change this valve so it's only 40% open instead of 50% open, actually it saves 10% energy across the entire HVAC system. Like that level of fidelity is new. And similarly, even when we first started the company, there were sensors we would have to get that cost $3,000. And now they cost like 120. And then we don't even need to get them because we can just punt to Joe's team. And now there's an entire company that will just do this for us. So that's pretty miraculous. And I think we're just starting to see maturity throughout the pipe enough that we can turn all of these technological wonders into real financial outcomes that can be tracked and measured along with the carbon savings they produce.
Well, and I think from a customer standpoint, that was one of the most compelling things for me, Brendan, is seeing the map of, you know, 30 million data points, you know, stimulated. It's as a business person who's trying to make money, you know, that type of analysis is instantly compelling. And so it's hard to argue with the science as long as you understand that the data is right. And we've done our due diligence, as you know, then those 30 million data points don't lie. We just never had them before.
Yeah, well said.
Thanks for your answers, everyone. It looks like we have another question submitted. What is your perspective on ESG or sustainability certifications? What are the benefits or drawbacks of certifications versus other ESG or sustainability solutions?
You know, I might jump in there just quickly because, you know, now that the whole real estate investment universe is sensitive to ESG issues, you know, they're all submitting scores and being ranked with the rankings and the ratings. But, you know, who defines those scores? You know, we're trying to kind of leap ahead because we think that technology is increasing so rapid. We don't, you know, I know it's important to measure, but once you have a baseline, you know, it's important to look for triples and, you know, doubles out there, not, you know, bunts. So, you know, I hate the baseball analogy, but I think you get the point is, you know, we're tired of talking. We want to actually do something. But as we look across, I mean, you know, there's nothing, it's hard to find the solutions you could do now. So that's the point of being incremental is we don't want to get our scores and rankings and ratings up. We actually want to make a difference, and we want to stay ahead of the curve. So, with that being said, from a business standpoint, I'll throw it to.
The mute button came on early, but I'll assume you threw it to me because I'll chime in here. I think the legacy of where certifications comes from is really important, which is, and it's actually related to the data question, which is certifications were really helpful when there wasn't data. And so not that long ago, we didn't have interval meter data. So interval meter data means the utility has a new, I mean, these are 15 years old now, but a new type of meter that gives you your whole building energy use every 15 minutes. We didn't have that. 2000, we had one reading a month, and often the utility would skip it and they'd estimate it for 1 month, and then they'd actually read the meter the next month and they'd true up. And hopefully a lot of people on the line here are old enough to remember this, but that makes statistics really hard. Like if you have 8 data points a year, there's very little to do with that. And these certifications were a solution to this, which is, okay, it's a big process. We're only going to do it once a year. And we're going to dive in and do a bunch of manual work so we can try and figure stuff out. And I think trying to solve that problem was a big part of where these certifications came from. The world has changed significantly. And when Eric talks about leapfrogging ahead, one of the ways we're trying to facilitate that is providing the raw data that, regardless of what happens with the certifications, makes them get better. And even if there isn't a certification, it's obvious to everyone what the results are, which is, here's the real emissions from this building. This is what they were 3 years ago. This is what they were 2 years ago. This is what they were last year. This is what they were this month. Check it out. It's going down. Here's what the average emissions are for all the buildings. Invest here or buy this company's product, because we're providing transparency around the actual carbon emissions coming from it. And so I think certifications, depending on the market, can be highly valued or not. But the ability to access raw data now and actually track real outcomes is categorically different than it was certainly 20 years ago when certifications were really taken off.
Yeah, I just put a short double click on that one because I couldn't agree more. The ability to see not only the emissions, but what the performance is of all of the different equipment inside this complex system called a building or a utility or a manufacturing plant in near real time with very short intervals also allows for a kind of exploratory data analysis that allows the building operator or the asset operator to actually be back in charge of their asset rather than relying on their vendors. And they can also measure and verify if the vendors come and done what they said they're going to do, and the expectation was it was going to do X was going to change to Y. Now you have the measurement and validation capabilities to be able to increase the accountability of your vendors to actually helping you solve the things that you set out to do. So it cascades all the way down from the investor, owner, operator, vendor, service provider, so that everybody can give a better, higher accountability solution to the problem that we're all trying to, or the opportunity that we're all trying to maximize.
Well, and I think to Brendan's point too, this is highly important to investors and users right now. And your point on transparency, flows all the way from the person controlling the equipment all the way to the user and the investor in the same automatic format, right? Or the ability to tweak it lightly. I mean, when we started this, we were tracking, Energy Star data in spreadsheets, and that has to go away. We just can't do that, right? And so, having Carbon Lighthouse, and you can ask for your report anytime you want. Here's how many tons of coal you didn't make is beautiful, because it lets you send an email to everyone, all your tenant users and your investors. And with the increased regime of reporting requirements from investors around ESG, it's just exploding right now. And so the more you can automate that, the more money you're going to make as a corporation as well on the corporate side, because there's a lot of internal ESG reporting I have to do for the company as well. So it has to serve a variety of interests, but hopefully we can get to the point where it does that automatically. And you guys, thank you for putting us ahead of the curve on that particular point.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'd imagine there's a lot of folk online who are still tracking Energy Star reports from Portfolio Manager and spreadsheets.
Yep.
So
And that's what digital transformation is all about, taking those manual efforts and labor that you only do once a year and making it a digital offering, a digital service, so that you can get value much more quicker and be able to differentiate yourself from your peers.
Great. It looks like we have another question submitted. When talking about data-driven technologies and solutions, what type of data is critical to gathering and measuring when looking to decarbonize?
yeah, I'll hop in. I think there's two questions you need to ask to actually answer this. So the first is, what would you do with the data if you had it? Because I think it's very tempting to just try and measure everything. And so, for example, the way energy studies are typically done is you can hire some firm to do an energy study. Often the utility will pay for it for free, and they'll give you a report about how many lights you have in your building and how many windows you have. If you've already done a lighting retrofit, that data is useless. Like, you already have LEDs, you're not going to change them. That's irrelevant information. And similarly, even if you haven't changed your windows, we've worked in, I think, like 1,200 buildings or something at this point. One single time did replacing the windows make financial sense before they just had to be replaced. And that was at a resort in Death Valley. Death Valley. That is what it took for that to make sense. So the first question to ask is, what are you going to do with this information? How do you take the data and change it into action? And that needs to be answered first. Like, we're trying to make a change here that results in a financial outcome and a carbon outcome. So what is the outcome desired? What data do we need to facilitate that? And then the second question to ask is, how accessible is it? Can you just use Optio3? Because we can get a whole lot of data if you can. Can you not? Some buildings can't. Maybe you don't have a BMS. Maybe you don't have a control system at all. Maybe you have Eric Smith, the facilities maintenance guy, who has to walk around to 150 different air handlers every day to change the manual damper position. And like, Eric wouldn't be caught with that sort of building, but we've seen that. We have buildings that are held open by 2x4s on the dampers. Like, there's not a control system. So I think asking the question first of like, what is the outcome we're trying to get, and starting at the end, followed by what is the cost of that data, is the right way to approach that. And what we found is that the answer to those questions changes building by building. And so our whole system has been designed, the Clues software system is designed actually to answer those questions so we can get the data that's needed. But there's not one answer per building. There is, however, one system that can reliably answer it each time.
But you still can plug and play. I mean, that's what I like about it too. Once you're on your system, and if you want, 500 more points of light, you basically call Carbon Lighthouse, and they make it happen.
Yeah, I think that's one of the beauties of what we talked about before about cloud compute scalability and cost. So, one of the things we run into a lot, and especially with what I'd call old school energy efficiency programs, is people will say, yeah, there's only 200 or 300 pieces of data that we need to answer the question about this building. And so they focus on only collecting that data. And yet it turns out that, terminal units and human activities and other things are actually the source of the demand that drives the use of the equipment, that drives the energy bill. And unless you get all the way back to seeing how the human factors are influencing things, you're not really in a position to understand all of the steps that you can take to be able to make things happen. And so this is one of the things we believe in, is you should have no limit to seeing all of the data. But on the other hand, you don't need to be overwhelmed by having all of that data, because you have companies like Carbon Lighthouse that can make models out of the stuff that is most obviously valuable. But in partnership with them as a permanent historian for all of the data, anytime you need to go back and say, hold it, but what about this? All the data is there. And that's a really big differentiator when you're looking at, which partners to be looking to. The folks with a little bit more of a futuristic perspective understand these kinds of things, whereas the companies that are chasing digital transformation are still doing it the old-fashioned way.
You know, but the other thing is too, as a building owner, you know, you're prepared, you're more prepared for the future and what new innovations come out than you are if you don't adopt this approach. You know, I just think that's undeniable. And I think, you know, having this data too, and having companies that have put together data sets as big as yours is now, is, you know, I'm excited about the future. You know, when I lose a pump, you know, you're going to be my first phone call about what's the most efficient pump on the market and what's a long lasting, you know, cost efficient pump, or from a climate perspective or whatever. So I think that the future is exciting, but you got to put the infrastructure into play tomorrow, today.
We have a couple minutes left for just one more question. There aren't any standards around ESG. So what's the best way to go about setting our decarbonization or ESG goals?
I think you've got to set your own baseline. You've got to understand where you are first and what the opportunities are, you know, for improvement about where you are. It doesn't matter if you have a goal, if you're 100% away from the goal, but you've got to start. And it's about, as I said, it's about incremental improvement. And once you realize what you can do, can you do a lighting retrofit? Did you do a whole building commissioning? You know, we went through with Carbon Lighthouse and we found, you know, what I would call administrative, operational, and physical anomalies throughout our system that nobody had any idea about. And so now we've corrected those. You know, we've done a lighting retrofit, and I don't think anybody can argue that we could be doing any more to save electricity until we get an increased technological innovation. So, you know, because of that AI, we've done as much as we can. So it doesn't matter if we have a goal, as long as we're using the current technology and we've got good data. You know, we can only do what we can do, but yeah, that's where to start.
I just have a quick anecdote on that. And this is where I think PK Global can come in and provide some guidance as well. So we have a one particular customer who is part of a business community that does a lot of sharing of data because they're all non-competitive, but doing roughly the same thing. And so they have a benefit of sharing data. And so they allow for benchmarking within their peer organizations. And so anything you can do, you know, using people like PK to help, you know, that early stage of the project, getting benchmarks in place and using that to be able to establish goals, and then doing what Eric was talking about and what we in Carbon Lighthouse do together, you can get a pretty good idea of where you stand fairly quickly. And then it makes it a whole lot easier to chart your own course rather than being guided by, you know, well-meaning people who don't sit in your shoes.
Yeah.
Go for it, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, you know, in digital engineering, whether it be moving and modernizing an application or migrating your data and AI into the cloud, it's just digital transformation. And, you know, the tools and processes that we have used and continue to use can be applied to sustainability as well, because it is, just as Eric said, leveraging technology to be able to update your business processes for a business benefit. And, you know, that's really where PK fits into this solution.
Yeah.
Brendan?
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I think that the key element for me there is, what is the business outcome we're trying to achieve? ESG is a huge field. The E lends itself to measurability much more directly than some of the other parts. And so what we often see is our clients tend to focus there first. And then there's a whole range of questions to ask. So, you know, Carbon Lighthouse is set up to help people reduce their energy consumption and reduce their carbon emissions directly. And sort of regardless of how you're measuring an ESG outcome, that will benefit it. But I think it's a very important question, based on what industry you are in and what your goal is. Are you trying to attract consumer demand? Does your consumer base know what scope 1 versus scope 2 versus scope 3 emissions are? If they do they care about some of those but not others? Because if they care about scope 3, that's a very different question than if they only care about scope 1 and 2, which is how much energy you're using in the buildings. So I think that's an important question to ask. Or maybe your consumer base cares a lot more about social, and that's what you're going after. Or maybe your capital base cares particularly about governance, and that's the area to shore up. So I think starting with PK to ask this type of question and go through their process to help answer these questions is a key thing, because the business outcome has to come first. And then once that's established, we can bring all the technology in the world to bear to reduce carbon emissions and boost profits. But we got to know the outcome we're going for first.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Sean, Joe, Brandon, and Eric for your presentation today. And thank you everyone for your questions and joining. We will be sending out a recording and the slide deck in the next day or two. So please keep an eye on your inbox for those. And then we'll also include a couple of different ways for you to get in touch with us. Thanks again, everyone. And
thanks, everybody.
Future webinars.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.